Spears are one of the absolute most important weapons from all of history, from all around the world. And most spearheads are relatively small. Why, therefore, are some spearheads so massive? We're going to look at 6 reasons why some spearheads are longer than others. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, as many of you know, I specialise in historical weaponry from across history, from around the world, and I'm an antique arms dealer as well as being a YouTuber. Now, most spearheads, you'll be familiar, whether you've just seen them on movies or in books or in museums, most spearheads aren't that big. They're basically as big as a knife, okay? Because when you think about how they're predominantly being used, they're being used as stabbing implements. And you don't usually want a particularly big spearhead on the end of a long wooden shaft because you need to be able to handle it very often in conjunction with a spear if you're using it one-handed, or even if you're using it two-handed, you want it to be fairly nimble because that's one of the great advantages of a spear. And being a long weapon, you don't want a huge amount of weight added at the end because you're not swinging it around and hitting with it like you would do with a halberd or a poleaxe or a mace or something like that. You want it to be a nimble, stabbing, thrusting weapon. Moreover, when you stab an opponent in combat, you don't really want any more penetration than is enough to go into their body or head, whichever part of their body you're aiming at. Beyond about 5 or 6 inches is pretty much useless, as I explained in a recent video, which I'll link down below. So therefore, why are some spearheads so much longer than others? Because if we look at history around the world, across the centuries, there are certain types of long spearhead. So here we're going to look at 6 reasons why you might choose to have a long spearhead instead of a normal size spearhead. But just very quickly before we dive into those 6 reasons, a quick word about our amazing sponsors for this video, who are Mova Globes. So today's video is sponsored by Mova Globes, link below, and there's a special offer just for viewers of this channel. I've now got several Mova Globes. I've had them for a few months and I even gave one as a Christmas present. They're fantastic gifts. They are the globes, they're educational, they look cool, and they rotate from the power of the sun alone. So long as they have access to UV light, they just sit there rotating forever. I absolutely love the way they float around inside the ball like this. Now, Mova Globes come in a variety of designs. You've got a whole bunch to choose from there on the website. This is actually Lucy's, and this one is mine. And they come with a variety of different stands. This is the pretty much standard Perspex stands that come with them, but you can choose wooden stands and various different types of designs there on the website. And also, they've got great educational value to them as well. And these are also a great talking point when we have guests over. They pretty much always want to come over. They go, wow, what's that? And they want to pick it up and handle it. So my special offer for you here today, just for viewers of this channel, I've got a special URL down below, down in the description there. If you click on that and you use the discount code SCHOLAR, you can get 10% off the 6 or 8 inch globes. And thanks again to Mova Globes for sponsoring this video. Thanks for checking that out. Now let's get back to the main topic of the video, 6 reasons why you might want a long spearhead. So the first reason we're going to look at is actually penetration. Now many of you will say, what the devil are you talking about, Matt? You've just done a video recently telling us how over penetration and penetration beyond, let's say, about 6 inches is basically useless. Why would you want to penetrate deeper with a long blade on a spear? Well, it's as simple as this. Sometimes your targets aren't simple, unarmored humans, okay? Sometimes they might not even be human at all. Let's think about horses, for example. So, for example, if you're armed with a type of spear which is to be used either on horseback against other horsemen, where you might deliberately target the horse rather than the human, or indeed, if you're on foot and you're expected to face a charging horse, then in those situations, because the horse is a much, in case you haven't noticed, a much bigger body than a human is, and because of where you're likely to be stabbing it, particularly from the front, you want a blade which will reach inside that horse and penetrate enough to bring down the animal, in the same way that certain hunting weapons, like harpoons, are bigger than arrows designed to shoot against humans, because these weapons need to bring down large creatures. So, horses is just one part of it, and that's just one aspect of penetration, okay, which is the first and probably the biggest reason that we're looking at here. But sometimes the opponent might be armoured in various ways. So they might be wearing thick padded gambeson, which means that's adding inches on to the amount you have to penetrate to get into their body, so to speak. In addition to that, there's another very important aspect of penetration, and that is shields. Okay, and I've got a shield here as an example, and without picking that up, if you imagine I'm holding it away from my body, if I penetrate the shield, I have to get through the shield and get to the person's body. Now, there's one very famous type of spear, if we can call it that is perfectly designed for that, and that is the Roman pilum. And I've done a number of videos about this, so has my friend Todd, actually, on Todd's Workshop channel. And fundamentally, this and many spears like it are fundamentally designed as spear penetrators. So they're designed to, shield penetrators. They're designed to get through the shield and get into the person who is holding the shield away from their body. There's other similar weapons like this as well. There's the Samburu spear in Africa. The Massi Spear is a little bit like this to some extent. There's also the Angon from sort of early medieval Dark Age Europe, which is kind of, you could say, a descendant of the Roman pilum. And there's other things. So this isn't a unique solution. But again, it comes back to penetration. So we've got a long shaft on this. And actually, if we look at the Viking era as well, we find certain types of very long spear point. There are short ones as well, and the short ones are more normal, but we do find long spear points, not just the angon, but sometimes just long shank-like spear points. And my opinion is that apart from penetrating armour, which they might do slightly better than a normal spearhead, the main purpose of these long shanks is to get through a shield to get to the person behind it. So it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about a specialised thing like the pilum or something like this later medieval winged spear here. In all cases, we're dealing with longer blades that are probably primarily designed that way to give greater penetration, either to get through shields to get to the person behind, or to get through layers of clothing and armour, perhaps winter clothing as well, cloaks and stuff like this. And finally, to penetrate deeply into horses and stop and bring down horses when a shallow stab might not achieve that. Now, the second reason why you might want a long blade is really typified by weapons like this winged spear here, or indeed something like a later partisan, and really it's about cutting. Okay, so there are certain types of spear where for various reasons they decided they didn't want only the ability to stab, but they also wanted the ability to give some degree of cut, be it a push cut, a slice, so in other words a pull cut, a push cut, or a chop. Now, these are never going to be fantastic cutting weapons. They're never going to cut as well as certain things like bills and halberds, you know, essentially almost derivatives of chopping implements like bill hooks and axes. These are fundamentally relatively slim shafted and fairly long. So as soon as you hit something laterally with these, you tend to get a certain degree of flex in the shaft, sometimes even some flex in the head and the socket. So you lose energy in the strike. But that being said, as I've said, you can do pull cuts and, you know, powerful enough cuts to incapacitate an opponent to follow up with a thrust. And the other thing to remember, of course, is if you've thrust at someone and they've knocked your weapon aside, so they've defended a thrust, if you can come back with a raking cut, it gives you another sort of tactical option, another technique essentially in your toolbox. And of course, if we're facing against horses or certain other types of opponent, it might be that cutting is particularly useful in certain scenarios, certain situations, when just being able to thrust with a standard spear, you need something a bit more than that. So there's the second most obvious, I'm dealing with the obvious two first, obvious reason for having a long blade. And just actually, here's an African example. This is Sudanese, which is a different design but achieves the same goal. Obviously, you could chop with it, and obviously you can thrust with it. And the other thing to say as well is in these situations where you've got a wider blade, that would of course in the stab, you'd have more resistance going in. It'd probably be worse at stabbing into armour, for example, a mail, more likely to stop it than something like a narrow shank like a pilum. But into an unarmoured opponent or a horse, it will create a larger wounds channel or have probably a more immediate effect and incapacitating effect on the target. So sometimes you have a longer blade is accompanied with also being a wider blade, as is the case in this African Sudanese example here. And in fact, just as a brief tangent, here is a Massi Spear, which is from my stock from my antique business. And here you can see you've got a hugely long blade. It's basically a sword on a stick. But you've also got a shank spike end at the other end. And interestingly, in old videos of Masai hunting with these, they very often throw the shank end at things that they're hunting, and they very often fight with this end. So you've got you've got the reach of shield penetration, you've got the ability to slice and cut with this end, but you've got the ability probably to penetrate shields perhaps more effectively with the shank end. And probably easier to pull out, and potentially for throwing there might be some advantages to throwing that end, because that seems to have been what they did as well. So sometimes you do get spears which have two long ends in the case of this Masai example here. So we've now dealt with the two most obvious reasons why you might have a long blade on a spear. But here are the perhaps more subtle examples. Now at this point I want you to get posting in the comments below and let me know, can you think of any extra reasons, any additional reasons for why you might want to have a long blade on a spear? And let's see if any of the ones that you can think of are in this group of 4 coming up now. So the first reason is against grabbing. What do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, if we look at something like the Fairbairn Sykes dagger, for example, one of the reasons given for the fact that it's got edges on it, despite the fact it's primarily a stabbing implement like a spear is that by having edges on it, it makes it more difficult for the enemy to grab the blade or try and disarm you. Okay, so sometimes having edges is very useful against grabbing and disarming. Now with the spear, this is particularly important and notable because, I'll just put that one down for a second, I'm actually going to pick up the pilum here because this is a paradoxical example. The pilum, if you can get within range of it, is actually very easy to grab because it's got a completely blunt shank up here, and obviously the shaft is blunt. A standard spear, I'll just pick up my reenactment spear here, so it's blunt tipped, but it'll give you the idea. This is also fairly easy to grab. So if you're armed with a sword and you're in armour, if their stab comes in and you parry it, or it dunks into your breastplate or glances off you, or even if it wounds you, your ability to grab their weapon is quite easy when it's a spear, because it's quite difficult to move it laterally quickly enough to avoid someone grabbing it. And you've essentially got a long handle. One of the problems with spears is, well, one of the good things is you've got a long handle. One of the bad things is the opponent potentially has a long handle to grab. So you've got a lot of socket, you've got a lot of shaft, and you've only got a small head here, and very often they're not edged, so you can grab them. Now, therefore, if you've got a long edged blade, like this winged example here, that could be really good against grabbing. So if you are concerned, if you're using a polearm, you're using a spear in this case, and you're concerned about people grabbing your shaft, so to speak, and trying to disarm you, or charging in and stabbing you with their dagger or their sword or whatever they have that's shorter, then having edges here, even if you're not using them for cutting, is really good to prevent them from doing that. Now the next reason is against cutting. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the vulnerabilities of a spear is if your opponent has a cutting implement like a sword, for example, be it a big Zweihander, a one-hander, whatever, it could even be another pole weapon like a bill or a halberd. One of the dangers to your spear is the shaft getting hacked. Now, I'm not going to suggest that generally speaking a blade like this can chop through a spear shaft in one go. Maybe a very thin spear shaft, but certainly not an ash spear shaft like this example here. However, we have done experiments with these, and we have found that with several hits or successive hits, so in other words, in a battle, your shaft can get snapped because of people hacking into it. So, if your shaft being chopped into is something you're concerned about, then one option is to have languettes, which are iron splints down your shaft, but that adds weight, it makes the weapon slower. Conversely, another option is to look at all the other advantages of having a long head, and have a long head on your spear, because now what that does is it means the reach where a person's trying to hack at the end of your spear, they're not going to be hitting the wooden shaft, they're going to be hitting the steel or metal head. Okay, so by having it, again, even if you're not cutting with it, this is now slightly anti-grabbing. It's quite good against people who want to disarm and grab and control your shaft, control your spear. because they can't get to the shaft, and if they're trying to chop through the shaft, if they can't reach the shaft because you've got enough blade out in the front. And that would even go, incidentally, for something like the Roman pilum. You can't really chop a Roman pilum off because it's got a great big iron shank, and you're not going to cut through that with the gladius or the Celtic sword. Then it's a very good thing. It's an added strength to your weapon. Now, this next point about why you might want to have a long head on your spear is sort of conjectural and theorizing, and it's to do with balance. Okay, so all weapons have different balance, different swords balance in different ways as a result of their taper, both in that plane and that plane, but also, you know, how long their hilt is, the size of the pommel, the weight of the guard, these types of things. So they all have different balances, and therefore some of them are better at chopping, some of them are more nimble with the point, some of them feel lighter in the hand and are quicker, some of them feel a bit clunkier but hit with a lot more force. So you can gain different things by balancing swords in different ways. And I think when we talk about spears, we often think of them as just, you know, a pointy stick. But they can be a lot more complex than that. And some spears were very high status with very expensive heads, obviously even more so as we get into the Renaissance with things like partisans. But even with these winged spears here, having such a large head gives it an extremely different balance. I mean, the balance point on this one is there. It's quite close to the head. Now, that gives you a whole bunch of different things. That means that if you were to hit with it, it hits with a significant amount more force than something which is balanced back towards the middle because it's only got a very light head. I mean, literally a pointy stick would, if it was parallel all the way along the shaft, would balance in the middle, wouldn't it? And this balances up near the head. But not only just hitting, because that might not be the primary thing, just the way that it moves and the rotational points and the way it handles in the hand. So I'm not going to, that's probably deserves a video of its own at some point we can talk about. But fundamentally, balance. By having a longer head, even if it's not for any of the other reasons, it changes how the weapon handles and also makes it more difficult. For example, if someone hits the end of the spear to beat it aside, beat it down, knock it aside, beat it upwards, whatever with their sword, if you have the point of balance closer towards the head, it will have less effect on your weapon. So it will react against other weapons and really move in a very, very different way. So balance. So the final reason is more cultural than practical. It's showing off, intimidation, status. Sometimes I'm certain that in tribal societies, whether it's Dark Age Europe or whether you're in Africa or Asia or anywhere else, sometimes having a big spearhead shows your virility, shows your power, shows you, I can handle a big spearhead, I can handle a long one, I can afford a long one, because remember, these materials, again, in any tribal society, anywhere in the world, any time, these materials were often expensive for them. So having a longer spearhead shows that you can afford one. I'm not one of those levied peasants off the farm who has a typical little spear. I'm a lord, I'm a thane. I'm going to have one of these big winged spears when I go to fight the Vikings who've just invaded. So I think there's all sorts of cultural reasons, and even to do with your social class, your social rank, your wealth, who you're trying to impress. There are all sorts of reasons why you might have a larger, in any sense, could be longer, could be wider spearhead. And I've mentioned that in regards to these Sudanese spears. Functionally, in my opinion, there's no particular reason why these Sudanese spearheads should be as big as this. But they are, and I think part of it was showing off. And if we go to a different African spearhead, if we go back to the Massi spear here, it is absolutely evident if you look at different Massi spearheads that they vary in size a lot. And some of that must have been to do with status and wealth. So there we go. There's my rattle through 6 reasons that I can think of why you might choose to have a longer spearhead. Some practical, some cultural. Did you think of any others that I didn't mention? Do you think I've missed any glaring ones? Do you think I've understated or overstated certain points? I'd be interested to see in the comments down below. But I have been Matt Easton. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I will be Matt Easton in the next video as well, and hopefully you'll be there to join me. So take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.